pleasure to introduce the third lecture of Professor Celia Applegate. This is the third of the Mosse program lecture series. The Mosse program, most of you know, but if you don't know, I'll take this opportunity to do a little advertisement. This is the flagship of the history department at the Hebrew University. It's a joint program between the Hebrew University and UW-Madison. The program is named after George L. Mosse, who taught in both places. Many of you know. The program today funds graduate students, MA, PhD students. We have an exchange student program. Students from Jerusalem go to Madison. Students from Madison come here. Faculty exchange, a series of publication, the UW Press, and the crown jewel, the lecture series. We try to find for the lecture series the most interesting, influential scholars to speak in this event. And I have to say, I can't remember who suggested Celia Applegate, but there was, once it was suggested that she will be the speaker of the next series, there was an immediate consensus among the committee, and mind you, academics are not famous for reaching consensus. Teaching at Vanderbilt University, Professor Applegate has published some groundbreaking studies in German history, cultural history. What is groundbreaking? For example, her Nation of Provincials, the German idea of Heimat, was written before most of our students were born, and yet it is still there on the mandatory reading list of our German history courses today. Her studies on music and nationalism are regularly taught at our graduate research seminars, and perhaps the most important evidence of her significance is that our PhD students who write on modern Germany tend to feel that they need to argue with or against Celia Applegate's studies in order to be serious. Professor Applegate had and has leading roles in the institutions that shape our profession. As the president of the German Studies Association, and as the chair of the AHA, the American History Association's Modern European section. But her impact exceeds merely German history. In the past few days, I have received some nasty messages from upset colleagues in the Department of Musicology. How come we are having an event with Celia Applegate without them? I am polite, I didn't tell them what I think about that. But this is only to show you the importance of, or the interdisciplinary importance of our speaker, and to say that this is exactly what we had in mind when with the Mosse lecture series, an intriguing discussion of topics that link different disciplines and different interests. Before I give the floor to Celia Applegate, I wanted to thank to the ones who made the series possible. First, Sky Donnie. Sky, in the past few years, Sky has filled in the big and conspicuous shoes of John Tortorici as the director of the Mosse program, and he's doing a wonderful job. The program runs smoothly, and we feel we have a friend in Madison, so thank you, Sky. Aya, the highly competent chair of the history department at the Hebrew University, who is also the Mosse program on the Mosse program committee, and is the engine behind the great operation of this series. I would like also to thank Matthias Schmidt, the administrative director and research coordinator of the Koebner Minerva Center for German History at the Hebrew University. The center co-sponsors this event. As well as the workshop we had this afternoon, the graduate students or research students workshop. Just a word about the Koebner Center and Mosse. As the director of the Koebner Center, I replaced Moshe Zimmerman, who replaced George Mosse as the first director of the center. And of course, last but not least, Tali Hardiman, who made it all happen. Tali, thank you very much. Okay. Thus far, the lectures we heard explored the connections between music, normally associated with leisure, aesthetical consideration, manifestations of national or regional mentality, etc., and modern work. We heard first on various reflections on the functions of music as work and the implications of its designations as work. Then the second lecture yesterday analyzed the historical development of music into a modern profession in Central Europe of the 19th century, including the emergence of manuals for music laborer, studies and analysis of the work of musicians, the sophisticated division of labor system that started to develop, and the emergence of agents and workers' union. The concluding lecture tonight is titled Music at Work, Singing and Self-Organization in the Workplace. Celia, the floor is yours.
I too want to thank the very same people that you have just thanked, Ofer, including you. Sky, I couldn't have done this without you. Ofer, welcoming me here. Aya, Stephen Asham, who's not here, but who yesterday and the day before he introduced me yesterday. And I just don't know what I would do without Tyler. I mean, really, we both, David and I, are so happy to have met you and happy to have you a friend in our future too. So this has been a very happy time for us, and I hope it will. This lecture will still go smoothly as the other ones has. The subject, as Ofer was telling you, my third and final lecture is music at work in a variety of places and people. For music-loving, concert-going people, music represented something that had little to do with work. It was a leisure activity, a pleasant pastime. It was a form of cultivation, but hardly work or something one did at work. There was a great deal of scholarly work on composed music and musical instruments from the music historians and musical theorists. They were published in serious music journals, lectured about in public and academic venues, all of which Germany and Austria had an abundance. And as I mentioned in the first lecture, the German Professoriate were also embarking on experiments and investigations in sound, including the sound of music. That's Helmholtz and Billroth, who I talked about. Social scientists, Georg Simmel and Max Weber, to name two, were also writing about music. Not a lot, but something. Writing about the socioeconomic functions of music. I didn't talk about them, and I'm not going to do that today. But other scholars were collecting examples of musical sounds from around the world with the help of new recording devices. But it was none of these people, not Simmel, not Weber, not Helmholtz, not Billroth, not the people who were doing the recording devices, none of them were the ones who first wrote systematically about the connection between music and work. These laurels, if laurels they be, go to an economist called Karl Boucher. I hope I have a picture of him. Yes, I do. He wrote a book called Arbeit und Rhythmus, Work and Rhythm, published in 1896. Boucher did have a forerunner of sorts in Johann Gottfried Herder. In the 1770s, he had called for educated Germans to pay attention to the music all around them, sounding in the streets in the form of folk songs, provincial songs, peasant songs. He said they were in streets and alleys and fish markets, and people should be listening to these and writing them down. But Herder was mainly interested in music's relation to language and religion. He did not pursue the topic of what relationship these songs might have to the work of these peasants and artisans. He acknowledged the creation of music by all classes of people and the presence of music in places of work, but he went no further than that. Likewise, the many anthologies of folk songs, mostly for use at home, Hausmusik, which I talked about yesterday, there were scads of them produced in the 19th century, and not just in Germany. And a lot of them had work songs in them, but they were rarely identified as such, and there was never commentary. These were books for playing at the piano at home. So Boucher's work was different. His engagement with music was a sign of a scholarly engagement with the advent of industrial modernity in Germany in the late 19th century. It was as important to understanding German musical culture as were concert halls and opera houses. That's what I want to argue. Boucher was 49 years old and an economist at the University of Leipzig when he published Arbeit und Rhythmus. It is a book about the birth of music from the experience of work. And it was a thoroughgoing, wide-ranging effort to link together these two very basic bodily functions, laboring and making music. He was born in a village in the Taunus, north of Wiesbaden, and he died in 1930 in Leipzig, a man whose lifespan encompassed Erich Hobsbawm's ages of capital and empire and extended well into the age of extremes. His background was artisanal and rural. His father was a brushmaker, a mother who was the daughter of a baker. He went to the gymnasium and then to the universities of Bonn and Göttingen, and he became a teacher first in Dortmund, then in Frankfurt. There he found his calling. In his autobiography, he wrote that he had awakened from his rural and classical slumbers and became aware, and now I'm quoting him, of the questions of the day and the greatness and harshness of Bismarck's Germany. He began writing articles for the liberal democratic Frankfurter Zeitung on social and economic issues, and he joined the Verein für Sozialpolitik, that densely networked group of socially engaged academics and social reformers. Here they are, and you can find Boucher somewhere in here. I think it's him. They're not named actually in this. It is. He was one of the youngest of these, but he established himself as a coming man in the historical school of political economy and began writing studies about the origins of present conditions, examining things like slave revolts in the light of the modern labor movement and other things, going way back to ancient times for the slave revolts. By the 1880s, with a reputation of being a very clever person in the historical school of political economy, Boucher began his academic career in earnest. This took him first to the German university in Dorpat, present-day Tartu, then to Basel and Karlsruhe, before he moved to the chair in economics at Leipzig. He worked in this prestigious position, a colleague of Wilhelm Wundt, Friedrich Ratzel, and Karl Lamprecht, until his retirement in 1917. The Leipzig period was his most fruitful. This is the cover of a 1893 edition of his first influential work, Die Entstehung der Volkswirtschaft. It was published in 1892. It went through 17 editions in Germany and was translated into English in 1901 as Industrial Evolution. Its impact was such that by the time Arbeit und Rhythmus came out 4 years later in 1896, reviewers referred to it as the work of a learned professor at Leipzig, the author of brilliant essays on the origin of economic life. Work and rhythm, as I shall continue to call it, not Arbeit und Rhythmus, was a study of the nature of work. It was inspired by his earlier investigations into cooperative modes of work and informed by his wide readings in travel literature, ethnography, psychology, physiology, musicology, and not least his original field of interest, ancient history. He explained, although work is the starting point for forming all economic phenomena, nevertheless, a thorough investigation of its essential character by political economists has until now seldom been undertaken. We treat it, he said, as something unique unto itself, distinct from any other kind of human activity, such as play, sport, the practice of art, the movement of the body for health reasons, and so on. Why, he asked, have economists only devoted themselves to studying how work is organized rather than what it is physiologically and mentally, how it is undertaken by human beings, and this is his words, with minds filled with associations and with nervous systems easily affected by their environment? So he began by analyzing the actual physical motions involved in such activities as threshing, grinding grain, breaking turf, pushing, pulling, lifting all manner of heavy things such as sails, logs, rocks, animals. From this physical foundation, he built an argument that not only reasserted the argument of his previous book on the division of labor, but also accounted for the whole world of cultural production as well. So this unlikely edifice was built on the element that was the second term of his title, rhythm. For Boucher, it was a matter of our animal nature, our physical being. He wrote, "The activity of the lungs and heart, the motions of our legs and arms when we walk, are in normal circumstances rhythmic, or at least have a tendency to be so. The trotting horse and the loaded camel are alike with the boatman rowing or the blacksmith hammering. Rhythm regulates energy needs. It makes possible the division of labor. It is the lubrication, these are words he uses, the machine oil of the human body. It mitigates the weariness of muscles. It awakens pleasurable feelings. It frees the mind for creative thought. In the simplest forms of economic activity, the bodily labor to feed or shelter one and one others in times and places where the most simple tools aided the human body or none at all, rhythm was intrinsic to the successful completion of physically demanding, repetitive physical effort." I mean, all of us have, I think, have experienced this when you're trying to have physical exercise. And the more protracted, Boucher said, of the labor, the more rhythmical it tends to be. Very interesting observation. This applied both to the individual and collective labor. So I just want to give you now a little taste of his style. He describes one kind of labor in which people work independently side by side in order to get the job done more quickly. They dig and mill and mow and spin and weave. They pluck geese feathers. About these activities, he writes that rhythmical movement links each one taking part in the work to his neighbor through the succession of his movements, combining all by means of the tempo into unity of the system, making it automatically a working organism. Here are Smith's hammering. Another type is alternate tempos. The Smith's hammering, bum, bum, bum. Woodman chopping a tree, maids beating carpets, sailors hoisting a sail, labor that could have been done alone but would have been far harder and more wearisome. Here are some of them. Penobscot Bay in 1930. This last kind of labor aggregation is joint labor, the cooperation of various kinds of labor supplementing one another. He conveyed this as a list, which has a rhythm of its own. Smith and bellows man, rope maker and man turning the wheel, mason and hod carrier, those placing and those pounding in the paving stones, hunters and beaters, musician and dancer, blower and organist, drummers and pipers, judge, bailiffs and clerk, doctor and attendants, a theatrical troupe, a brass band, and orchestra. So, how did we get so effortlessly from the Smith and bellows man to the brass band and orchestra? His answer builds, these are all of the ones that I'm talking about, his answer builds on his ideas about the physical toil of labor. As more cooperation in labor evolved, more contrasting tasks coordinated with each other, and more difficult work rhythms needed to mesh with each other, and the naturally involving response to this challenge was music. Boucher hypothesized that in the beginning of human labor, a percussive or some other penetrating sound coordinated multiple bodily movements, voices perhaps, or some other kind of penetrating sound with drums or flutes. But his larger conclusion was that soon primitive people figured out that music, sounds made by voices, could enhance the rhythmic character of manual labor. This is a page from his book. It would make them more nearly automatic, less tiring. And beyond even those benefits, music aroused pleasurable feelings. And he came to these conclusions by a bold process of intuitive, inductive reasoning that began with the phenomenon of the work song. These he had been collecting since his childhood in the Taunus, as I said, and he continued to gather them as he moved from place to place as an adult. He had, for an example, a small treasure trove of Estonian and Latvian work songs. They dated back to his days in Dorpat. In working on the book, he vastly expanded his collection of work songs. These are not very interesting because they don't have a picture, but this is how his book was. He would describe the work that is going on, and then he would put in here with a German translation the words of it, and you can kind of see the rhythm in it, and the same as this one. Those two that I just showed you were a Maori rowing thing from New Zealand. It wasn't New Zealand then. And the other was pulling flax. And this one, this is the picture of pulling flax. Okay. So that was his modus operandi. The first edition of the book included some 80 songs, and subsequent editions added even more. By the third edition in 1902, there were 269 work songs included in the book. And he would add more in subsequent editions as more and more people were sending him examples of things. Some of these things, like the Maori thing, were sent from people that were living down under. It was a collective effort. We would now call it crowdsourcing. These songs came from all times and places. They provided witness to almost 2,000 years of laboring, from ancient Egypt to modern Germany, from Native Americans to Estonian peasants to Japanese fishermen, people who were free, bonded, and slave labor in fields and forests, homes and workshops, at sea, on rivers, on land. Boucher organized his abundant material, first by the labor they were doing, and next by the parts of the work the songs came from. But his essential argument was the same for everything and everywhere and everyone. Music didn't shape the work, it emerged from it. Work and rhythm and the music they produced were universals. No group of people were more musical or more hardworking than any other. Women worked as hard, probably harder than men, he said, and perhaps produced more of the music and the poetry than men had. So Boucher constructed his subject, as I think you have taken it, as humanity, not just music. His discipline was not music or physiology, it was economics. Its laws were relevant everywhere. The evolutionary story he told was not unlike that depicted in various ways by Richard Wagner with his playful, natural Rhine maidens, treating the Rhine gold as a toy. In the beginning, work, play, music, and poetry were all of a piece. No activities were shut off from one another. He explained how he had discovered in his research, this wonderful quotation, a series of threads, the ends of which are widely separated in this modern world, but the farther back in the past you follow them, the more they converge in the pathless darkness of earliest mankind. In this darkness, song was called forth from the rhythms of work. In a less poetic tone, Boucher regarded this beginning as the starting point of social evolution, from integration to differentiation, from unity to division of labor. The division of labor produced the separation of music and poetry from work, which allowed music and poetry become art and be more cultivated and enjoyed as such. Musicians and dancers and their close associates, priests, shamans, theologians, and philosophers were, in some sense, the first to form separate groups in the great story of the division of labor. The origins of development of harmony and melody, so central to thousands of years of music analysis, at least 1,000 years of music analysis, so crucial to the characterization of distinctions among national groups. These were all secondary developments. He didn't really know much about them, but he theorized that they were not as important. They were interesting. They had an economic value of sorts, but mostly for the pursuits of leisure. Apart from that, they were just so much cultural noise. He is an economist. Boucher investigated the past to understand the present. Looking at the condition of laboring bodies in his own time, he thought that something essential had been driven out of work. Rhythmic work had not been soulless. It had been cultural work, the work of strengthening human solidarity. The problem he saw in the present was that work no longer did that. And as I've told you, it's late 19th century and early 20th century. He ends with a dystopic vision of whirring, deafening noise, its rhythmic character unrecognizable, and its effect only unpleasant and exhausting, a never-tiring mechanism. Further, the old music of work was gone. There was no more cheerful play and merry pleasure, only serious duty and often painful renunciation. He acknowledged that our material situation was more comfortable, our artistic experiences were richer, but his final hope was that people could find in their lives something he called a higher rhythmic unity, something that would provide a fleeting cheer in our soul and a harmonious feeling in our bodies. That was the best legacy of the early mankind to our modern lives. And it was this final note that resonated in the scholarly and cultural milieu surrounding him. Boucher was not the first to sound it. Some of his writing about rhythm will sound familiar from my first lecture. Just a year earlier, Bill Rote, who had helped to make rhythm a buzzword in the 1890s, had talked about these kinds of things, but not in the way that Boucher did, and besides which the Bill Rote book was only published in a very small edition. Arbeit und Rhythmus was, in contrast, an instant success, even a sensation, widely read and reviewed. As I said, it went into 5 more editions. That went through 1924, and each time they were expanding more and more with more songs. In effect, he was never free of this book. It was translated into Russian and into English in an abridged form by the Music Education Division of the New York Works Project Administration of Roosevelt's New Deal. The book consolidated his reputation as a scholar of originality and imagination and aroused strong interest among scholars now associated with disciplines like musicology and ethnomusicology. Some people in political economy were also interested in it. And when the ears of the scholars of musicology engaged in it, it was mostly about the origins of music. They were interested in that. Somewhat surprisingly, Arbeit und Rhythmus had little to no impact on these investigations. This is not a case of the dog that didn't bark, an absence of a reception that it is in itself revealing. Rather, it's a case of the dog that barked, but people thought the dog was barking up the wrong tree. I have several people who said that, not exactly in the way that I did. The first was Carl Stumpf, a polymath, cognitive psychologist, phenomenologist, origin of Gestalt theory. He was also the author of a 1911 book called The Origins of Music. He mentioned Arbeit und Rhythmus just twice, calling it interesting and substantial, but dismissed out of hand the idea that work songs were an enormous part of the music we know among primitive people. The more sustained demolition of Boucher was left to his student, which happened in those days. And his student was a man you might have heard of. He has a wonderful name, Erich Moritz von Hornbossel, who is one of the founders of ethnomusicology. Writing in 1911, I guess, did I leave Hornbossel out of my slide?
No, you were asking.
Oh, yes, because I'm holding my paper on here, yes. Okay, there he is, Hornbossel. Writing in 1911, he acknowledged, this is quoting from him, "Few monographs of musical science have found so wide a circle of readers, including experts and laypeople." Then he proceeded to take apart Boucher's claims one by one, demonstrating to devastating effect that Boucher was ignorant of even the most basic aspects of how music worked, and his work song collections were arbitrary and unscientific, ripped out of the contexts in which they should be studied. Hornbossel was undoubtedly right about Boucher's lack of musicological expertise, but his critique sort of missed the point. The early ethnomusicologists, all steeped in Western classical music, categorized world music in terms of harmony and melody, not rhythm. Hornbossel's takedown was pretty much the end of the musicologists' attention to Boucher's book as a work to be taken seriously. So much for the professors, the early ethnomusicologists. They had no rhythm. Boucher ended his book hoping that it would be possible to combine technology and art in a higher rhythmic unity that will cheer the spirit and bring harmony to the body. This hope was taken up. It was taken up by the emerging field of industrial psychology, a technocratic effort to reform the sphere of industrial work. It was quite technocratic, it was quite psychological, and one of his American reviewers noted about the book that it made the possibility of making even routine work interesting by means of art. It shows us that what the most enlightened manufacturers are doing to reduce drudgery and surround the work with pleasant associations is no new thing, but as old as the human race. And this is where Munsterberg comes in. The man on the steps of Widener Library at Harvard is Hugo Munsterberg. William James had brought him to Harvard in the 1890s. He was German, he had been a student of Wilhelm Wundt, one of the founders of modern psychology in Leipzig, and he was also a great admirer of Boucher's work. In his 1913 book, Psychology and Industrial Efficiency, Munsterberg took Boucher's line in arguing for the possibility of enhancing the work experience by making the machine more adapted to natural bodily rhythms. But Munsterberg, a literal-minded fellow, he also wrote approvingly of efforts he had encountered in the US to bring music into the workplace. Not exactly sailors singing while hoisting their sails, but Munsterberg thought it might have the same effect. Many factories, he said, in which labor is noiseless, as in the making of cigars, have introduced gramophone music or reading aloud, and it is easy to understand theoretically. Again, my paper interrupted my lecture. So Munsterberg said that, music reading aloud, it's easy to understand theoretically that a certain animating effect results, which stimulates the whole psychophysical activity. He suggested the possibility of researching the influence of certain musical keys on exciting or relaxing the rhythm of work, and asked what rhythm and what duration of aesthetic stimuli would bring the best possible economic results. He thought also that you might achieve the same mobilization of a worker's psychophysical energies with a factory cat. So much for Munsterberg. I'll take this away. That's just silly. But he did say that. In Great Britain, this was in the United States. In Great Britain, Charles Myers, the founder of the National Institute for Industrial Psychology in 1921, investigated good methods of work for the purpose of obtaining from any expenditure of humane energy or effort a maximum production. They're all into that. A quick look through the Institute's journal reveals many references to rhythm and music, such as an article on incentives and repetitive work. Take, for example, one of a series of pieces on the worker's point of view. This one was written by a researcher called Louis Cotton, who had worked at a printing press. He noticed the possible effect of whistling as he was doing his job and singing during tedious tasks. In his experience, and I'm quoting him, the jobs that require the least mental effort induce the most whistling, and that employers should not discourage it because it aided concentration. He then enters into Boucher land with a touch of Orientalism. He writes, and this is a longish quotation, "Whether or not one is inclined to whistle really hinges upon the degree of rhythm attaching to the job. There seems to be something in the human makeup which induces a man to make music as a complement to rhythmic labor. The Kafir who chants at the Hallage and the Arab porter who has songs to sing as he runs are familiar examples. When doing rhythmic work, I have sometimes myself suddenly became aware of whistling. Making music was unconscious, and not to whistle at such times required a conscious effort." So far, from music hindering work, he concluded, we find the jollity and good spirits engendered are a distinct aid to production. They're always talking about production. Boucher himself was not a reliable witness when we try to understand the actual role of music in modern workers' lives and their loss of control over the rhythms of their work. What little he wrote about his own experience of music consists of childhood memories, hearing farm workers singing as they worked, or hurdy-gurdy players in the village square. He also makes passing references to how we moderns feel the stirrings of our rhythmic nature when we hear a lively military march or a jolly dance tune. At one point, he remarked that military music was a rare example of music accompanying modern work. He never wrote about military bands nor workplace brass bands and choral groups, all of which were the most obvious examples of music at work. They were music at work in two senses: music at the workplace and music at work in society. So I will turn from Boucher and take the case of the military bands, which he mentioned. We know that they expanded in number and ambition in the decades before and after 1914 in most countries in the world that had military bands. They do not leap to one's mind when considering Boucher's hope to bring together technology and art into a higher rhythmic unity, which would once again give us the spirit of fleeting cheer, but maybe. But they were certainly ubiquitous, and the work they did was national work in every nation that had them. By the last decades of the 19th century, and in many places around the world, men in uniform performed in parks, marched in streets, and accompanied civic occasions. They were a pervasive aspect of the soundscape of modern life. Some 20 military bands, large and small, performed regularly in Berlin alone in the 19th century. And over the course of that century, the numbers of military musicians grew rapidly. Military bands improved the quality of their music making. They pioneered the use of many newly invented instruments, basically wind and brass instruments. And they extended the range of their repertoire to include many new works and transcriptions of compositions that we associate with civilian musical life. They played marches aplenty, but also potpourris of opera and operetta, and even band transcriptions of Beethoven's symphonies. This is the most famous of the bandmeisters in Germany, a man called Wilhelm Wieprecht. Much of this was the achievement of this man. He was an ambitious violinist in the Prussian Royal Opera. Can't touch that. Excuse me again. Get rid of this. Okay, he was in an opera. He was in an opera orchestra. He was bored. He was looking for more things to do, and so he became a member of the Prussian king's personal regiment band and proceeded to make his career. And at the end of it, he had overhauled all of the entire Prussian military establishment. So this is a man who was a career that was not decided for him when he was born. He added many more musical works to the wind ensemble repertoire, including at least 50 of his own marches and overtures and about 60 of his transcriptions of overtures and symphonies. This relentless effort made art music an increasingly prominent part of the military band repertoire in Germany. He also, and I talked about this a little yesterday, he perfected a military ceremony called the Große Zapfenstreich, the military tattoo. It brought together, and you can see it in this picture, torches, marches, fanfares, a serenade, usually a transcription of art music, presentations of arms, troop reviews, prayers, and anthems. This spectacle gradually became a ritual, an invented tradition, really. And still, despite the controversy it has caused in contemporary German society, it exists today as the highest form of military recognition in the Federal Republic of Germany, reserved for the retirement of a German chancellor, president, or defense minister, as well as military officers of the highest rank. Such is the power of music. You can see it on YouTube anytime. Prussia was not the only state that invested in music in the form of military bands. Post-Napoleonic Bavaria also jumped on the military bandwagon. The establishment of a citizen militia in 1807 led to a tremendous expansion of small military bands all over Bavaria. The king regarded them as particularly important for winning over the population in his newly acquired crown lands, such as Franconia. Approval of military bands became a majority opinion over the course of the 19th century, and not just in Germany. They were the sonic and visible demonstration of national identity, nationalism, and competition among nations. The latter was made visible and audible, very audible, in a series of national military band competitions in the last half of the 19th century. The Germans didn't always win, but that's beside the point. By the end of the century, Germany had a military musical establishment of some 560 bands, employing about 17,000 musicians and reaching every state, province, city, and town in Imperial Germany. Military bands were just one manifestation of popular nationalism in music. Singing was another, even more ubiquitous. Every German man, woman, and child seemed to be singing in the 19th century. Much of the singing was working for a cause. The two most prominent were nationalism and socialism. Already by mid-century, nearly 1,000 national music festivals had taken place in the German lands, each representing the work of multiple societies and hundreds of singers. By the time the war broke out in 1914, choral societies of many types had mobilized tens of thousands of people. The defeat of Napoleon in the Battle of the Nations in 1813 was the occasion for the first large singing festival. It set the patriotic nationalist tone for the choral movement of the whole 19th century. It was most overt in male singing societies. The heyday of these nationalistic choral societies came between 1830 and 1930. Tens of thousands participated in thousands of groups. They were active before the 1848 revolutions, in the revolutions, and after them. In 1862, they formed a German singing confederation to strengthen the ties between these different places, and soon it became a regular event. The work of choral societies was also national work. Their radical counterpart in pre-Germany was the workers' singing societies and bands. Pre-war Germany, sorry. Most workplace bands and choruses were founded by the workers themselves, who understood them to be an area of relaxation, autonomy, the strengthening of bonds of comradeship, all things that Boucher approved of in his writings as a member of the Verein für Sozialpolitik. Choruses and bands had been expanding rapidly in the socialist movement since the 1860s. They were a subset of the all-male choral singing in general, and a radically different model, part of the alternative culture of socialist labor, in Vernon Lidke's phrase. Ferdinand Lassalle and August Bebel were avid singers, you might not have known that, and had helped form the workers' choral societies. The songs they sang were often in the mode of ideology simplified, a bit like Luther's hymns, dogma and musical mnemonic together. In 1878, when the German Empire's anti-socialist laws went into effect, singing took on added importance. Singing in small groups became a way to evade authority and yet experience solidarity. When the laws lapsed in 1890, the number of singing organizations and festivals multiplied rapidly, with singing festivals celebrating solidarity through friendly competition. By 1900, nearly every locality with an active labor movement had at least one festival every year. They became increasingly ambitious. At a concert, you could hear international workers' songs and marches, often played by factory, firemen, or colliery bands. Many of the workers who founded them had previously served in the ranks of military musicians, then founded workplace bands when they were released from service and taught untrained workers to play instruments. At the May Day Festival of 1893 in Solingen, the musical program opened with a Jubilation Festival March performed by the Solingen Firemen's Band. Then came the male chorus, Concord, to sing the socialist worker song Seid gegrüßt, composed by one of their members, followed by an aria from Donizetti's Lucia de Lammermoor, and ending with a rousing chorus to the tune of the French national anthem, which they called the Workers' Marseillaise. Folk songs, among them work songs, were also a major part of the repertoire of the singing workers. When the war broke out in 1914, the men who had played in factory bands could hope to be recruited to an expanding number of military bands and orchestras. They sweetened the departure of troops, they ginned up the crowds as the troops marched past, and they made for very good press. Professional musicians before the war were also able to keep their profession simply by putting on the uniform. Some worked behind the lines, such as a 35-man musical corps that was stationed in Bruges in September 1914. Their work included ceremonies, of course, but also concerts for soldiers and visits to the wounded in hospitals. Others were closer to the front. They gave occasional performances when the shelling stopped. They also worked as stretcher carriers. This was the case of Paul Hindemit, 22 years old and already the concert master of the Frankfurt Opera Orchestra when he was called up. Sent to the front lines in Alsace, he joined a military band stationed less than a mile behind the lines. They played dance and march tunes for the soldiers rotated back from the trenches for a few days of relief from fighting. And after he arrived, the commanding officer, a music-loving count named Kielsman Egg, his favorite composer was Claude Debussy. Kielsman Egg recruited Hindemith to be part of a string quartet of soldier musicians with Hindemith as their leader. After the war, the singing did not end. Social Democrats and Communists both encouraged their members to sing, though they were not always singing from the same page. The SPD's German Workers' Singing League already had the advantage of the extensive network of local singing organizations, and it expanded to a hefty 6,000 of them. Their repertory, like the SPD itself, became mainstream to an extent. They put emphasis on artistic excellence and social assimilation, more than on, and also a lot of emphasis on cultural enrichment, but not on political advocacy. In line with Wilhelm Liebknecht's speech from 1872, Wissen ist Macht, Macht ist Wissen, the leaders of the German Workers' Singing League embraced classical music. Their conviction was that the great artists of the past had much to say to the proletariat. Lieder, oratorios, cantatas, excerpts from opera, folk songs, work songs, all of these proclaimed their integration at last into German society after the war. Leaders of some SPD musical organizations were adamant about high quality. music along bourgeois lines, especially for choral singing. Their national festivals in 1922 and 1929 were disciplined. Drinking was frowned upon. This is an SPD band. Drinking was frowned upon. Most of the repertoire was classical, and the audience included not only workers. This raised some questions about the rank and file. At the local level, social democratic singing groups still maintained the repertoire of militant social ideology, and some people complained about complacency. This is one of my favorite quotations by a man named Walter Henel in 1928. What could be worse than a boycott of workers' choral concerts by the workers? Are we singing for the bourgeoisie? Next time we should try a program of socialist fighting music. Still, Henel, charmingly, described Schubert as truly a worker in music. And at the local level, there was a mixture of art and militancy, the ideal which had for a long time characterized the German Workers' Singing League. One branch articulated it this way: our worker choruses pursue two objectives. Through dedication to inspiring songs of freedom, we seek to call our brothers to the struggle against an unjust world order. Through dedication to art, in its most widespread and simplest form, singing, we seek to bring culture to the broad masses. The League showed a more fighting spirit in 1931. Under the pressure of mass unemployment, the agonizing weakening of democracy, its members staged a massive festival of Red Song in Berlin. It included audience participation, red flags waving, marchers, singers performing political songs and cantatas. Social Democrat music making also shared much, including overlapping memberships, with the German youth music and folk music movements. In 1930, the founders and writers of a journal called Music and Society, Working Papers for the Cultivation of Music in Society and Music Policy, very good long German title, belonged to this milieu, the youth music, folk music milieu, and the social democratic one. Some of them moved to the right in this journal. Many of the people who wrote in this journal moved to the right after Hitler came to power. Fritz Jöde was one, a leader in the youth music movement. Others went into exile. The journal was suffused with references to work and song and devoted a special issue to Boucher's theme of work. They thought that rhythm was a principle of economic development, also in industrialized work, and his speculations about the social meaning of music in the proletarian work day and the rhythm of our time. So they're Boucherians, I guess. Gerhard Kowaleski, who was a locksmith at Berlin Siemensstadt, wrote about music in the modern industrial factory. There was no possibility of singing while you work in a large factory, he wrote. The mechanization of work has made the worker almost like a machine, working without the cooperation of the thinking brain. If the worker sings or whistles at all, he does not do it in connection with his work, because modern work requires him to avoid all mental exertion. So much for rhythmic song easing your working day. A few took the opposite view. Helda Weigel was a typist. These are people writing in this journal. She reported that the women working in typing pools listen to dance music, or better, to hit songs. In fact, we listen to tango, one-step, foxtrot, never waltzes, because the rhythm is wrong. The title of her Arbeit was Wir schreiben nach Musik. We do our typing to music. And it will not surprise you to hear that both parties on the extreme ends of the political spectrum in the Weimar Republic took an entirely different stance, openly, aggressively political. And so to that I will now turn. Political work, whether in solidarity or in protest, was also musical work. The communists cultivated the agitprop coming from the Soviet Union. In Germany, its milieu were young and unemployed Berlin proletarians who had rejected the social democratic musical culture. Hans Eisler, too many things there, sorry about this. We're now up to Hans Eisler. Undoubtedly, the most important German communist composer in the Weimar Republic, composed his first effort to make contact with the proletarian masses in 1926, with his 3 male choruses, Opus 10. He distrusted what he considered the thoroughly petty bourgeois aesthetics of the SPD singing groups. Sentimentality ran amok, and hoped that he could transform collective singing into a relevant community art with a strong impact on the masses. They were not a success. They were too difficult for the singers he wanted to reach, but he persisted and helped to found an alternative working-class singing organization, which he called the Militant Community of Worker Singers, a Kampfgemeinschaft, associated with the Red Front Fighters League. In collaboration with Bertolt Brecht, he wrote the music for Kule Wampe, or Who Owns the World, in 1932. The Solidarity Song was his masterpiece, and I hope some of you have heard it. It was also, importantly, a response to the Nazi stormtroopers' fighting song, Die Fahne hoch, the lyrics of which had been written by Horst-Wessel in 1929, a Sturmführer in the Nazi SA. Later, it was known as the Horst-Wessel-Lied after he had been killed by communists in 1930 and became a martyr for the Nazi cause. By then, the stormtroopers had a repertoire of fighting and marching songs, quite a lot of them plundered from the Social Democrats and the Communists. They just took the tunes and they put in new words. The Communists and Social Democrats who were thrown into the early concentration camps hung on to their music. There is a rich and growing historiography of music in the concentration and labor camps, and indeed in the extermination camps. We know that this music was often initiated by prisoners. Music was one link to the world before 1933. It undoubtedly helped people to maintain morale and brought some comfort. But of course, there were severe limits to the autonomy of the incarcerated. We know these efforts could be forbidden, punished, or cruelly mocked by the guards who held the power over them. So let me end with Karl Boucher. This is a topic that could be 3 or 4 lectures, and there's, as I'm saying, there is a lot of work on this now. But this lecture is long enough, and I will end with Karl Boucher as I began. In writing about the work rhythms and the music that accompanied that work, he recognized it was often created by the workers themselves. He also recognized that rhythm was imposed on the workers as a matter of discipline. He gave examples from the slaves who built the pyramids to prison laborers working on the peat moors in Germany, something he had seen himself. Boucher died in 1930, so he never heard one of the most famous and defiant work songs ever written, Die Moorsoldaten. That's the end of my lecture, but I could play the Moorsoldaten if you want to hear it. Yes. Yes. I think I have a thing for it. Okay. This is the original copy of this is a copy of the original peat bog soldiers made in Bergen-Moor in 1933, and this is a prisoner drawing work in a concentration camp. It's a prisoner drawing. So here we go. How do I touch this? Okay. This is a YouTube thing, because I don't know how to put things into PowerPoints. I should know. Is this gonna, okay. This is Ants Bush, 1938.
Die Moorsoldaten.
Is that too
Das
loud?
Lied unserer Kämpfer
Can
in den
anyone
deutschen
turn it down?
Konzentrationslagern.
Do you know how to do it? Yes, right there. Oh,
Wohin auch das Auge blicket, Moor und Heide nur ringsum. Vogelsang uns nicht erquicket, Eichen stehen kahl und krumm. Wir sind die Moorsoldaten und ziehen mit den Spaten ins Moor. Wir sind die Moorsoldaten und ziehen mit den Spaten ins Moor. Auf und nieder gehen die Pfosten, keiner kann hindurch. Flucht wird nur das Leben kosten, vierfach ist umzäunt die Burg. Wir sind die Moorsoldaten und ziehen mit dem Spaten ins Moor. Wir sind die Moorsoldaten und ziehen mit dem Spaten ins Moor. Doch für uns gibt es kein Klagen, ewig kann's nicht Winter sein. Einmal werden froh wir sagen, Heimat, du bist wieder mein. Dann ziehen die Moorsoldaten nicht mehr mit den Spaten ins Moor. Dann ziehen die Moorsoldaten nicht mehr mit dem Spaten ins Moor.
That's it.
Thank you so much for this fascinating talk, a fascinating series of talks. We do have a few minutes for questions and comments, so please.
Always standing in front of that.
Yes, please start.
Hi. Thank you, Celia, again. I was wondering if there was a conflict between like man and machine, because Boucher describes how the music emerges from the work, but machines also can make noises and they have a rhythm. So I'm wondering what makes music music or human music, and what makes machine noises, I don't know, something else. The sentient
Yeah,
component.
that's a very good question. I think he was living in his head in his childhood, and he was. Most of the songs that came in were basically agricultural and other kinds of things, digging. They were things that were not industrial work. And when industrial work became, he knew about industrial work. He had written a whole book on industrial efficiency and so on. But he didn't see it in the factory as possible, because the rhythms were, it was too noisy, and the rhythms were not the ones of a body. They were machinery things. So it's kind of, I think this is partly why the musicologists, and especially ethnomusicologists, didn't take him very seriously. Basically, the people who most took him seriously were the people like Dalcroze and these dancers and these kind of alternate modernity people who thought this is great, that's what we need. Industrial modernity is killing the workers and making them sick and all of this. And what you need is, outdoor work. It's that kind of thing. And so they really took up Boucher. I had part of this was, this was long enough, but part of this was about how it was taken up by these kind of alternate people, alternatives. And they just loved him because they thought it was the eurythmics things. And they did exercises to it, and they also sort of tried to find the melodies of these old work songs from other places. So he, in a sense, he became a sort of kind of, if I can call it, a hippie movement person, he alternative culture. And he was not like that at all. I mean, if I can show the picture of him, again, he is not a hippie kind of guy. Here we go. So you never know what the reception will be. But there was actually some interest in people having work time where they could listen to the phonographs. I said a little bit about that.
Michelle?
Thank you very much. First of all, you explained the childhood memory to me, so I want to thank you for that. The original Walt Disney had the dwarves, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs had the dwarves singing Whistle While You Work. And I was just thinking about that as you were speaking about whistling, so thank you, that was really, really nice. But I actually, thinking back on yesterday's talk and thinking about today's talk, I'm wondering about how many tunes were shared between different countries. In other words, to what extent do we have, nations really claiming specific music to themselves while they work and they did their own thing? Because you talked a lot about the German situation, but you started with that guy whose name I don't remember, I'm sorry, on the steps of Harvard. So I'm wondering how much was shared and how much was different here.
He really didn't. I couldn't tell it from his book because he didn't organize it by tunes, and that's too bad. I would expect it would be, if it be European tunes, are very much of them are shared. But because he was getting things from all over the world, not so much. And that's why the ethnomusicologists didn't have any respect for him, because they knew that there was. I think Boucher just thought everyone had Western tonality, and that's the way he would be singing these. And he did put tunes in there, but he was doing them in a Western tonality form. So I have no answer to that question. But the ethnomusicologists would say they had. Do you have an ethnomusicologist here? No.
Yes.
Thank you. Thanks for a very fascinating lecture today too. I know this is beyond the scope of this lecture, but I wonder how it continues, because I imagine that the comparison between the GDR and the BRD is very, there are two different things entirely, with Hans Eisler and Bertolt Brecht continuing pretty much what they did before the war, while in West Germany, they're things like the Moorsoldaten just end up in those small booklets for youth movements, and they would sing them, and there's no legacy really of this workers' song. I wonder what you can say in this comparison.
Yeah, they did have workers' song, anthologies in the GDR, and but I don't think they had. I should look into this more, but I don't think they were very much influenced by Boucher. It would have been the tradition that I talked about briefly about workers' songs, and I'm quite sure they stole a lot from the social democratic workers' songbooks and made them their own, because they had taken over the progressive movement. So, but it's for sure that Eisler wrote some things for them. I don't think the Solidarity song was ever sung in. Do you know anything about this, David? In the DDR?
Did live on in the front.
In that,
I mean,
yeah.
The thing that came up
yeah.
after the Ernstbusch was Hannes Vader, who was a West German, and he was. I think there's a recording of him singing it at an IG Metall Congress, you know, the big metal workers union. So I mean, on the left, and in sort of student circles, it was still known. But I mean, you're right. It was that there's a big difference in the legacy.
Yeah, and I just don't think that they sang Eisler's Solidarity song. No, it's not as good as more Soldaten. I mean, in the context of the film, it's quite wonderful, but it's not something that you could sing really, because Eisler was too sophisticated, really. I mean, I love it, but
The chorus is singable. It's the
yes,
when you get to the
yes,
verses.
yes, that's exactly right.
One comment and one question where you spoke about singing festivals, choral societies. It sort of reminded me of the Baltics of the 1970s and 80s, where in these three Baltic republics, the nationalism was expressed through singing, and in fact it became known as a singing revolution. It starts with folk songs and go to the nationalistic songs, and then everybody sings whatever it is, and that became a norm, and that's a common. The question is, back to Germany, is a link between these popular socialist orchestras and actually established musicians. Often in these orchestras, the conductors were very established musicians. Klemperer was one, others were very famous who conducted, and I'm curious about this connection between people whose music was, music making was their profession, and with kind of working class leisure activity.
Mm-hmm. So the question is, did these very, accomplished conductors have any connection to the workers?
Yeah, we have a connection between high culture of where they came from. You're conducting opera one day, and then you conduct with workers' orchestra the other day, and kind of connection between high culture and the popular culture, I would say.
Yeah, I think that I should have paused more on this, but I think that goes back to the Wissen ist Macht and Macht ist Wissen. So nothing is too good for the workers. I think that goes through in the GDR too, because there's a lot of literature about, classical music in the GDR at this point, and so they should have everything. They should have workers' songs, and they should have symphony orchestras and everything in between. And I think that was the official line. I don't think the things that they didn't like was, very commercial music. I don't know about jazz. I don't know much of anything about jazz in the GDR. Some people in here might, but I haven't studied that. But they especially the social democrat milieu that I was describing, wanted to be respectable, especially in the Weimar Republic, because they felt they are now a part of the government. And so they are going to, they don't want people to be getting drunk at their festivals anymore and that kind of thing. And that goes with classical music. Nobody gets drunk as a classical music place, do they?
Any other comments or questions? Well, let me thank you once again.
And thank you all. Thank you.